I think we underestimated the Communist Party and their intent. I find it a bit curious that our head diplomat in the country is a longtime business interest in China. I think it has come to a head, Michael. I mean, I don't think we're seen as a reliable partner in the way that we used to be.
General Mike Hood, good afternoon. How are you?
Yeah, great, Michael. Very nice to be talking with you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I really appreciate it. I think, with your past experience over a number of different conflict cycles from Cold Warrior to global war on terror to where we are now, I think your perspective would be really welcome for everyone. But before we get into what's going on today, just wondering if you could give, for those that don't know you, your background, your experience in the forces and where you're at now.
No, absolutely, Michael. Obviously, I finished my career as commander of the Air Force, but started as a navigator on C-130 Hercules aircraft, flying tactical missions, and starting from the first Gulf War onwards, certainly most conflicts we were involved with, or humanitarian disaster relief, I would have been part of. I commanded twice at the squadron level. Commanded 8-wing Trenton, the home of air mobility, where all those operations started, and then had a very interesting last 10 years of my career. We're all in Ottawa, which spanned from the policy group through leading the strategic joint staff, heavily involved with strategy development for the government of Canada, certainly force options as they were considering them. And then the last 3 years as commander of the Royal Canadian Air Force. I retired in 2018 and am now the chief of staff in a privately owned group of companies, primarily in the resource sector.
Okay. Now you finished up in one of the highest positions of policymaking in SJS and then headed the Air Force. Pulling it back, I'm wondering if we could start with your perspective geostrategically, despite you being out for only a few years. I think you discredit yourself by saying, oh, it's long past. But I'm wondering if you could pull it back to how you've looked at the geostrategic setup from your time as a Cold Warrior into, the 90s, the peace dividend. Then we had the global war on terror. And how are you seeing that transition and where we're at right now?
Michael, that's a great question. And, having spent certainly reflecting on it a lot more later in my career, so as opposed to where Canada stood up to that point, certainly the last 10 years, I think we've suffered from a bit of a short attention span as a country. And I think we found it hard to identify strategic interests and make policy decisions in support of those with the ability to sustain it. And sustaining means patience. It has to be able to border successive governments to be effective. I'm thinking of I used to always view NATO as an anchor on Canada because it was preventing us from looking westward as a Pacific nation and participating there. But I'm kind of, at mixed odds of those things, that they're both important interests to Canada. I don't know if they're essential interests, but again, I participated in trying to create a whole of government China strategy back in I think when I was in the policy group, and none of that's been able to sustain. Whether it's the professionalism of the public servants, to include the experience of the military. The hyper politicized view of these things, and by that I mean governments are putting themselves before the interests of the country. If it's going to work well to their base, it's going to become a policy option. I think, to be quite frank, we're seeing that now more than ever. So I don't see any improvement into this lack of attention, and I think it's beginning to have some real impacts as, you know, close allies who we used to have leading roles with are now moving on into other areas without us. We're unable to, yeah, we're not the partner we once were, and I think that's a bit lamentable.
I wonder if we can just focus on the specifics of trying to parse, you know, strong security engaged and a whirlwind of change over the last 2 years. What is the Canadian national security policy strategically around the world, and specifically with China? And I don't know how to break that down. And then maybe later on we can get into, you know, our situation, personnel, equipment, training, sustainability on how you see us stacking up with our core partners.
So strong, secure, engaged, which I, you know, participated in the development of as Canada. I'm not sure it counts as a true policy. I mean, it speaks to everything. It speaks to everybody, and all it really says is we're going to be a good partner with our friends when we choose to be. That it doesn't identify what are the core strategic interests of the country, and does not, you know, flange up with a foreign affairs policy, you know, to bring all of the tools of government power into play, and it stands on its own. And really, if you want to be, you know, even more cynical of it, it is that from a military commitment side, i.e. investments in the military and the notional procurement agenda, it didn't bring anything to the table. It pushed everything far out. Not unlike Harper's first defense policy and his plans to spend money, it came slammed headfirst into the economic crisis of 2008. Well, you know, when I see a defense policy in 2015 that has no new spending until 2022, and oh, COVID's come along, so it's not going to see the light of day. They're really, again, I think they're put out there to show their electorate that they're actually doing something on defense, highlighting a notional procurement agenda, none of which actually ever, yeah, I mean, do you think the government takes that policy and assesses how they're doing against it, says, oh, we need to do better on moving this file forward? Or, you know, we've participated in a peacekeeping mission in Mali. Is there a strategic Canadian interest to be served there? No, maybe there is an interest that we want to be a good partner to our friends in the world, and we're going to do our share in a burden shared scenario. But Canadian interests are probably more in East Africa than West Africa. But you don't see those things tied together. So I think the lack of truly identified Canadian interests continues to be a hindrance. And, you know, instead of a middle power, I think we're a middling power.
You wrote an article about a year ago in the National Post with regards to Canada's policy response and our trusting of global institutions, singling out the WHO and the UN, and not doing our own independent verification of facts, and using the whole broad whole of government approach on interests and deciding how we're going to act in this chaos. And is that Canada's foreign policy now, to simply rely on the globalist institutions and what we're fed from abroad, instead of really defining a course and charting forward? And if COVID was a test run, is that how Canada will proceed? Simply heading off over the horizon with a globalist agenda?
Well, listen, if the first and foremost job of any government is the protection of the citizens, of Canadians, that probably should start with the risks that we're likely to have to deal with, and making sure that we have Indigenous capability to deal with it. So the very fact that we were unable to produce vaccines as a G7 country was shocking, even to me in that regard, because it would have been, based on our experience with SARS and understanding the fragility of this, it would have been at the top, close to the top of a lot of lists the new government should look at, and making sure that they're making decisions to protect Canadians, because that's first and foremost the job of every government. I do think that we've become a bit insular, with the exception of some diplomats that have some more broad global experience or experience in NATO or at the United Nations. I think we're not looking very far out on the decisions that we're making. So, I assume the Prime Minister just went to COP26 and made some commitments. They probably sat down about 90 days ago when it was popping on the calendar and say, well, here's what we're going to say then. And I doubt that there was a whole lot of cabinet discussion about those things. So when interests are pop-up, calendar-based, egocentric, without having a policy document that comes out and says these are our interests, ones that truly put the country before re-election or political party, I don't think much is going to change. And to your point, we've bought our way out of COVID by thankfully being able to purchase vaccines. What's the next thing we're going to be able to buy ourselves out of, because we're a bit myopic with respect to what the threats and the risks we face are, I believe.
In your article, I just want to bring up I think it was a really fair point that the number one priority of the government and the military is to ensure Canadian sovereignty. And I just wonder, looking at the situation we have capability wise, because it comes down to capability, power, the ability to demonstrate this deterrence. If we're not able to match up to this, are we able to buy our way out of defending our sovereignty?
Well, I mean, I honestly think sovereignty is something you have or you don't. You can't be partially sovereign in some areas and not in others. It's the totality. And, first and foremost, if you're not sovereign within your own borders, and what I used to say as commander of the Royal Canadian Air Force, because I saw the Air Force as the guarantor of Canadian sovereignty, means the ability to get to every single square foot of our country with the ability to act, and with lethal force if necessary. Those threats, those threats, they ebb and flow, but I could probably on the back of my hand write down 5 or 6 that are real ones that we don't have the capability militarily to defend against.
So what are the consequences of not being able to do these baseline tasks that our key partners do? Looking at the UK recently offering to patrol our subsea space, satisfying NORAD requirements, patrolling in the Pacific, meeting NATO obligations. Does this come to a head, or is this simply?
I think it has come to a head, Michael. I mean, I don't think we're seen as a reliable partner in the way that we used to do. And I'm sure some of your listeners are going to take umbrage with my approach here, but I mean, I would say that the very fact that we've been slow to move on national capabilities with respect to NORAD, which includes a relevant fighter capability that's seamlessly interoperable with the US Air Force, first and foremost, has had effects. And I'll point to 2 right now. Keystone XL pipeline. Do you really think the US would be so careless with something of great strategic importance to their closest neighbor, one of their 2 closest neighbors? Would they be so careless if we were actually, a stronger partner alongside them? I don't think so. Would you see what I believe is the fracturing of the Five Eyes into, the 3 countries that are backing up what what we all believe to be the threats that we're facing today. And you could talk about a pact about nuclear submarines, but that's just part of it. It's just, it's officializing what's been slowly progressing behind closed doors, I suspect. And that will only bring a tighter intelligence circle that will be on the outside looking in, where we weren't with Five Eyes. And look at what's going on with the pipeline right now, Pipeline 5 through Michigan. And again, I mean, this is how most of the oil gets into the refineries in Sarnia, and you're potentially going to close that. I mean, these are hugely strategic things for our country, but counter to the narrative of this particular government with respect to lack of acknowledgement of a role the resource sector plays in our livelihoods, of our success, in our ability to be sovereign, and those type of things. So I think, when you start to be less dependable, and you could say from a military capability, but also on things of great importance to the U.S., like ballistic missile defense, where we've, for very narrow political reasons did not participate, those things start to accumulate. And then you get, whether President Biden was a bit clumsy on this decision, or whether, if you're not going to take your part of this friendship seriously, then why am I going to, waste a lot of energy and political capital on a pipeline?
Those are all really good points. And I just wonder, for a number in the national security sector, and yourself included, these signals seem to be reaching. There's things happening, and you can go, there's decisions being made, and what's behind that. And I think you pointed to that, but it seems that those luminaries in Ottawa, such as the Nossels, the Carvins, and the Chapnicks, seem to be saying, don't worry about it, it's okay. And I'll pull up a quote here from Dr. Chapnick. The greatest threat to Canadian interests comes from our American ally losing faith in our reliability. Then it's critical that Ottawa understands exactly what Washington wants from it. Better, I think, to build a foreign and defense policy establishment that can respond to our allies' shifting security priorities as they are made clear. A genuine, we're ready to contribute when asked posture. I'm just curious what your thoughts are, is if that is one of the leading luminaries in Canada.
Well, listen, with all due respect to Adam, who I know as a professor from my time at the National Security Program, I think he's got half of that right. But I think imagining that we're just going to be there to answer the call means, ponying up on fringe issues. I think the basis of it comes from a confident position of strength, backed up by the ability to act. And sometimes that's acting independently. I can still recall when I was in the SGS and we were developing options for the government following Russia's incursion into Crimea, and trying to backstop NATO, who, as you recognize, the ability to move fast is not something that NATO is particularly well built for when you have increasing numbers of members. But, we briefed the government on options both for Air Force, Naval, and Army, and they immediately chose to do all three, because they believe that, helping push and lead NATO into a strong response to Russian aggression was important for Canada, important for Canadian interests. And so I've been told by colleagues in the UK, as they were trying to decide some of their own options, when Royal Canadian Air Force F-18s are flying overhead, it tends to focus the minds of decision makers and some of our larger allies to join in. So I think, being able to back up, being able to act, being, strong in your conviction on these things backed up by a policy that lays it out for allies to understand where our priorities are key to certainly our half of that relationship. We're always going to be, responsive to U.S. requests. I mean, there's no command like NORAD anywhere in the world. A binational command that, with both countries involved in the decision making on the use of lethal support and the protection of the continent. It's quite unique. So we have the basis for it, but all of the other pieces around there, I think, have atrophied in a Canadian context because it's just not of interest to Canadians. And Canadian politicians are not schooled at all in thinking about national security or geopolitics in that regard. So, change of government, got to lead them up the curve a little bit more, or not if they have no interest at all in that. But it is starting to have an effect. And at least the two examples I gave you, I think, are part and parcel of that. You could even argue that the Chinese taking the two Michaels was also, a sign of waning Canadian influence in an area that we romantically thought Norman Bethune had guaranteed us a special place in the hearts of Sino-culture, and nothing could be further from the truth, quite frankly. I think they just admonished us or advised us not to send ships through the Taiwan Strait anymore. So they'll try and pick us off as a smaller power that they'll try and bully to get to their bigger policy aims. I think it all ties down to a lack of, focus and standing firm in a couple of areas and investing brain power, intellectual capacity, procurement horsepower behind being credible.
We've dealt with sort of your strategic perspective and some of the lapses within Ottawa, and this isn't a new thing. This is a historical trend for some time. I would be remiss if I didn't ask you your perspectives on how we got into such a crisis, and it's called a cultural crisis. I think the media has whipped up quite a storm, and now the Canadian Armed Forces are caught in a crosshair. On the one hand, I struggle with the creation of new commands and cultural revolution, and I wonder if this is not symptomatic of something that's been long-standing, in that we've underinvested in our forces for so long, lack of focus, and that negative interest rate on trying to build and bolster the current institution has led us here. I'm wondering if you can comment on that, and also your perspectives on how did we end up in this. It is a mess. We've got dozens of general officers in trouble, and this is going right down to the rank and file as well.
Well, listen. So first of all, I think the basis of our legal framework is innocent to proven guilty, and that's been turned on its head a little bit. A narrative from government that long before this particular crisis happened in the senior ranks of the military, we're seeing it elsewhere, where the mere assertion of something in nature of a sexual assault on a woman was, had to be taken at face value as true. And so that dynamic has slipped into this, where we've got, definitely, there are a couple of cases, and it doesn't help when the Chief of Defense Staff who's led this, has had, his own challenges with an long-time extramarital affair, which doesn't seem congruent with leading the institution. There's obviously a few people in there that will come to justice. I also think that there's a couple of people in there that we have to give them the benefit of the doubt and let due process take its course. And then there are, some minor infractions where I think the leadership of the armed forces should have acted swiftly and with little prejudice. I mean, when someone writes a letter of support to someone who's been found guilty of a sexual assault, I believe that lack of judgment is, again, not congruent with service at a general officer, and they should be retired the next day. You could say the same of someone golfing with someone who's under investigation for that. That's a very poor choice for someone who leads an institution and needs to be dealt with. And I think if they had been firmer in dealing with the ones that they could, it would not have perhaps grown to such proportions as it has now. Listen, there's no doubt that it takes time to change an institution. I would have always thought and hoped that the fellow general officers, men and women that I served with, had been, honorable, and to find out some of these allegations has been heartbreaking to me personally. But the institution needs to be able to withstand this. And let's be quite frank, who was the first person that government turned to when COVID happened? It was to the armed forces. It was to help public health put a plan together to deliver vaccines. It was to have nurses and medics go into old folks' homes in Quebec when even the staff wouldn't go in. So Canadians trust the military, and they need to be resilient enough to get through this, and it will pass. It's incredibly unfortunate. And I think it speaks to probably a gap of experience, a number of very talented people moving on before their time who may have had more experience to help navigate these things. I'm conjecture, Michael, to be honest, most of the people that I was very close with have retired as well, and I'm not in constant contact with them. And the only reason I am is I have a daughter and a stepson who are just starting their careers in the military, so I'm invested in making sure that they're joining an institution that is going to give them a meaningful and rewarding career, as my 33 years were.
Looking at the numbers right now, Acting Chief of Defense Staff Eric came out 2 weeks ago at the Kingston Defense Conference and made a plea for those experienced in the military to stay in. And this comes with, it looks like a parabolic upshoot of retirements, upwards of 7,500 unforecasted retirements in the past year. And it looks like the CAF will meet that unforecasted retirement number this year. So that's of a forces of 70,000, 7,500 unforecasted, with your standing attrition and recruitment reduced significantly. How does the military build back from this situation, and what is the Canadian Armed Forces missing to attract talent? How does this get reversed?
Well, I think there's a couple of things there, Michael. I think part of the dynamic of that delta in manning is, the virtual shutdown of training during COVID. And I have to be honest, I mean, we've been trained to fight in nuclear, biological, chemical warfare environments. I'm pretty sure if we'd had the will, we could have kept our training establishment open through COVID. Whether there were, broader political directives that would have prevented that, I don't know. I'm not, in the know on those. But the one thing you can't do when you're running an armed forces is stop producing, because you can never reproduce that gap. We know that in pilot training, when we let a whole bunch of pilots go in the 90s, you can never build enough capacity to get that back or fill that 2 or 3 year gap that is empty. So there's that piece. And I think there's a number of reasons why people are leaving, or some people leaving as a result of what we were just talking about, the view on leadership. Perhaps. I probably think it's less than we might imagine. And, is it because the government hasn't moved on any meaningful acquisitions, or, do you really want to fly fighters in the Air Force when you're going to be flying the F-18 till 2032 in the government's present plans? Maybe those type of reasons also contributed. But it's complex, and listen, I know there's a lot of good people working really hard to do that. I don't think the CDS trying to appeal to people to not release and stay the course is a particularly useful strategy, in my opinion. But then again, I don't know the depth of the crisis other than in the numbers you've just given me.
We've seen the recent hypersonic test with China. These other capabilities, the space, cyber, if we're not meeting our mandates for any of our current services and our allies are proceeding apace and our enemies are proceeding apace with these new technologies, how big is this delta that we should be concerned about? And what is your experience with space and cyber?
In all of the Five Eyes discussions that I participated in, and we used to get together as Five Eyes Air Chiefs, and the one domain where we were second only to the US was space. That because of our work, both nationally and our contributions to space, our capacity with MDA and others to actually build, satellite arrays. We were second to the US, and it was ahead of those other Five Eyes nations. And we were given a lot of actual trust in positions in US Space Command and seen as an incredibly supportive and meaningful ally, both through the types of satellites we put forward and how they fit into the mission set in an agreed kind of risk matrix where we needed to kind of put our energies. On the cyber side, to be honest, I don't have probably a depth of understanding and appreciation of how we are seen as an ally and where our capabilities stand. I know it's been a place of incredible investment on behalf of not only the Department of National Defense, but elsewhere in government. So I would be less concerned. I think both those areas show a lot of promise for us, but they need continued attention. When I was commander, I made the case to the Chief of Defense Staff and other senior leadership that space should be resident within the Air Force, because the majority of people that were working in the space domain for the armed forces were Air Force. And because it was under the Vice Chief of Defense Staff, it was not building a kind of career path and momentum that people would be in and out of it, or they would be in what's called a purple trade, which I didn't think was the right way to go for a warfighting capability. And I'm proud to say the Air Force has embraced it and invested and moved forward in that regard. But again, those are probably two niche areas. The rest of the big capabilities, well, there's promise coming on with ships and fighters. We've been 10 years absent in those. The fact that we're just having discussions about submarines now when they're coming to the end of their life, and you'll appreciate that, Michael. We're so far behind, and if we can't get successive governments to agree to a procurement strategy that can transcend those, liberal, conservative, or other whims, and make it a priority, we're going to continue to be middling, because nothing can get done in this giant bureaucracy. I'll use an example, and I'm again not trying to. I use these examples because I know them very well, because I was part of them, and they happen to be part of a particular government. And I'm trying to be apolitical in this. Any criticism of the present government is from stuff I saw firsthand as commander of the Air Force and participated in. But think back to this, the acquisition of the C-17. C-17 is a strategic airlifter of incredible capability and very important in support of Canadian interests, whether that's deploying the disaster response team to the Philippines, where Canada was, next to the US, the first nation responding in our big response in 2014, I think it was, Typhoon Haiyan. But the C-17, there should be no question it was a capability Canada should consider seriously. But the previous government at the time, led by Mr. Chrétien, absolutely wanted nothing to do with investments, and it was taken off the table. When it was brought back up as an issue with a new conservative government of the day under Harper, we delivered that capability 18 months. And 2 weeks after arrival, it was on its first mission delivering aid to Haiti. So where there's a will, in that case, we were able to talk to the US Air Force and say, can we have your next 4 off the line? And it's in their interest to see us as a strong, capable partner. They said, absolutely. Instead of being at the back of the procurement line, we were right at the front. We got the aircraft, we had people on exchange very quickly, and we were able to move that capability forward. So when you have the political will to make a decision, which cuts out a whole bureaucracy that, I got to be honest with you, as I think we've seen in COVID, has no idea how to risk manage, who are keepers of issues that another hurdle to get through before it's a yes. When you circumvent all that, things can be done very quickly and to great effect. My other example about, Canada's response to Russian aggression, when you get that direction, and I received that direction personally from the Prime Minister along with the Chief of Defense Staff in a closed briefing, we left that meeting and issued orders for movement because that was direction. So it's solvable, Michael. As I'm making it sound as lamentable as the system may be, it's solvable. It's absolutely solvable, and there has to be the political will to do so.
Just pulling it back to our earlier conversation about China, it seems like a lot of Canadians are a bit confused on where Canada's policy lies with the Chinese Communist Party. We're still in a pandemic. We've blown our balance sheets out to levels not seen since the Second World War, and yet we seem to be courting President Xi. Is there something I'm missing here, or have we gone astray?
Well, I find a couple of things curious. So one, I think Canadians generally think people like us, that we're likable, that we can put a Canadian flag in our backpack and it's panacea. I think those are romantic tales and that don't carry a whole lot of water now. So whether we thought, when Chrétien rode his bike on the Great Wall of China and it was the start of this, super tight relationship that was going to be to Canadian benefit somehow, I think we underestimated the Communist Party and their intent. I find it a bit curious that our head diplomat in the country is a longtime business interest in China, and immediately after the return of the two Michaels was suggesting that it's, that hindrance is gone and now's the opportunity to get back and invest in China. I take the exact opposite lessons from that, but that was the government's choice, and because he clearly didn't have the pull to get those two Michaels out any earlier than any other diplomat would have, quite frankly. And then let's talk about COVID-19. And while I'm not a mathematician, I'd be curious what the odds are of. And so the only, look at Australia, who stood up and demanded we needed a part of this. Okay, they're going to get punished by the Chinese, who, cancel all their iron ore shipments and other pieces. Probably stop bringing in Australian fish or whatever they happen to get from Australia. But Australia's found other markets, and that iron ore price has continued to soar, and they're finding other markets. So Canada's got to be resilient enough to stand up to this, or China's strategy is going to be knock us off one by one, bring them into their sphere. The Silk Road Initiative is really just co-opting countries that need economic aid on the level that the Chinese are promising, but at the end of the day are probably losing their sovereignty as a result. Whether it's the number of Sino-Canadians that are actually, working actively for the Chinese or providing information has to be countless. I lament when I hear a Canadian senator use the exact words that the Chinese Communist Party are to describe, an issue. They're in there pretty deep, and they can afford to be. They've got the people to be, and we just need to be smarter and better, and we need to play our role. We're a Pacific nation along with our allies, and trying to get them to a place where they're active contributors, in an open and transparent way. That's our economies are based on democratic governments supporting open and transparent trade and dealings, and it's not compatible with where China's going. And if I understand from the sixth plenum coming up, Xi is going to be pronounced alongside Deng and Mao as leader for life. It seems to be the exact opposite of the type of country we would want to meaningfully deal with. So I don't have answers to those things, but I urge caution. I was the guy responsible for bilateral military talks with the Chinese as director of staff, and I spent more time dealing with my Five Eyes counterparts trying to figure out what the Chinese were asking us and the type of things. When we all compared notes, we could probably figure out what their angle was, or where their weaknesses that they were trying to get smarter on. That when you're one on your own standing out there, you can be a bit naive to it. When you have the depth of, a group of countries that all see the situation the same, you can really punch above your weight.
It's interesting that you bring up Wuhan.
And, we'll find out a bit more about what was going on in the lab in Winnipeg, and the role that otherwise Canadian scientists were working on. But I've been just a bit shocked that outside of the Australians pressing for it, we've been absent. And you could argue, they had the two Michaels held hostage. Well, I mean, you cannot not act just because two Canadians, as unfortunate it is, are being held in prison. You still have to act for the good of humanity as well as our country. So I think this will be future podcasts as more news come out on this, Michael, but it'd be interesting to see.
Definitely. Wonder if I can get your final thoughts on how we can better structure national security policy within Ottawa. It seems like we struggle to have public servants and politicians up to speed. How is that solved?
Well, Michael, at first I kind of look at the military. General officers by their very nature are meant to be generalists. But some of us, myself included, if I had not spent 10 years in Ottawa as a general officer, with all of those experiences, I don't think I would have been as good as commander of the Air Force, because I was able to provide military advice to the Chief of Defense Staff and the government with all those years of experience coming in. One of the challenges that we often have in the military is, many strategic leaders were chosen because they were tactical experts. Reputation as a warrior in combat doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be a particularly good general officer in the Ottawa context. So you do need to specialize a little bit, and I'd like to think that my thoughts on international security policy and geopolitics and the rest stem from having spent an awful lot of time immersed in it. But let's look at the public service. I mean, go look at the biographies of, choose the top 10 DMs, and none of them have actually, maybe a couple on the financial side of, most of them bounced around, so that when you come to pick someone like a national security advisor, okay, well, there's some guys with some CSIS experience and the rest, but I often wondered why we didn't have a system a bit like the US. And I wouldn't go so far as picking ministers from outside as you would in the US for, the Secretary of the Air Force or Secretary of Defense. But why would we not have a national security advisor who was handpicked by the government, who was a professional in the field, who could then come in and provide advice that was not born out of, just pure government bureaucracy? That I think would be an interesting concept. We've got to start to build a national security culture in the country. I think that the magnitude of the issues we're going to face demand that we've got to up our game. And while it's easy to focus just on climate, and there's no doubt that that's an important area that we've got to bring a lot of energy to bear. Like I used to say, it's not ships or fighters, it's ships and fighters. So it's not just the climate, it's got to be climate and security, because the competition that's going to come through, the worst projections of the climate crisis are going to be national security issues. That, if we're not building the capability to respond to those right now, where's the assessment of what kind of military we need to respond to just our own national crises? That's not going on. So much like it's ships and jets, it's got to be all the other things and national security policy.
Before we go, I'm just wondering if you have a book or article that you'd recommend right now that's sort of shaped your thinking on how you're looking at the world.
Well, to be honest, it's quite funny. I was a voracious reader in all of those years in Ottawa. And to be honest, since I joined the resource sector, I had to get smarter on gold mining and other things. So I've read a lot there. There are a couple. I'm a big fan of George Friedman. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, but his most recent one, The Storm Before the Calm, is a real interesting take on the cycles, and actually deals with the bureaucracy. So it ties in a bit these cycles that have gone through the US, both economically, bureaucratically, and how these cycles, then end through some turbulent presidencies and enter a new wave. That was actually very, very interesting, although his prognostication is not good. And I've also just picked up Bill Gates' recent work on the climate crisis and how we can solve it now, because a friend recommended it because I had a lot of statistics. And I think, Michael, we're now in a world where, anyone who spouts a number out has credibility, but there's no backing behind the statistics people are using. So that's like what you've seen in COVID. I mean, the numbers that are thrown out, it's, no one else in the country has died from anything other than COVID in some cases. And that's not to be cynical. COVID's, incredibly deadly, and we've got to deal with it. But the stats behind it, we've lost the rigor that we used to have behind these things. So I wanted to get the climate numbers so I've just picked it up. Amazon delivered it yesterday. So.
No, 90% of statistics are made up, right? So, sir, thank you very much for your time today.